The dog tag is warm from where Jack has been hiding it under his pillow. Marvin watches the small fist curl around metal that's dulled by years and chewing and the kind of secret worship a 6-year-old reserves for imaginary heroes. He tucks the blanket tighter, smooths the hair from Jack's forehead with a thumb that still bears a faded tattoo from a life that used to be all knives and discipline and midnight drills. "Daddy," the boy whispers, voice all sleep and trust, and Marvin feels it like a compass pulling him straight. Outside the apartment, a city that never forgives slow decisions breathes in different lights. Inside, a pile of papers on the kitchen table catches the glow from a single lamp. Unpaid hospital invoices, a notice of an upcoming custody review, and a letter stamped by a lawyer for white pictures. A photograph sits among them. Jack at a birthday party, frosting smeared on his cheek, eyes wide as if the whole world still fits in a single noisy room. Marvin fingers the photograph until the edges fray. He could walk away. He could sell the truck, move to a shelter, work double shifts until he could buy breathing room. He's done those things before, but something thicker than pride binds him to Jack, a promise he never spelled out, a history of quiet refusal to abandon the boy. Jack didn't come with a pedigree. He came with a small hand that refused to let go. The letter from White Pictures is simple and cruel in its economy. It explains, in lawyerly sentences, a condition buried in the language of a foundation's charter. The White Medical Trust will finance certain high-risk pediatric treatments for dependents under the stewardship of a legally recognized guardian affiliated to the White family. That is not the same as a moral debt. It's a rule written into paper by people who measure kindness in ledger columns. The Trust's board answers to a family that does not hand out favors, only decisions that preserve the company and the legacy. Marvin remembers the first time he met Nathan White, at a neighborhood fundraiser, an accidental encounter that felt like two worlds colliding at a bus stop. Nathan was a big man, with the kind of hands that never pretended to be rough. He smiled, then watched Jack with an expression that made the room colder. Nathan offered a polite nod, a brief compliment about community programs, then a business card. Marvin tucked it into his wallet and for weeks forgot it like one forgets a dream. Now the card has a second life. The envelope contains more than a charitable line. Nathan's assistant, Dana, arranged a meeting. Nathan couldn't be bothered personally at first, but a hand on a string was enough to pull a man toward the White mansion. Agnes White opens the door herself the first time Marvin is led through the house. She wears armor masquerading as silk, a sharp-cut blazer, hair in a practiced sweep, face that says trust is bought and not given. The living room is a museum of controlled light. Paintings watch them like patient judges. Jack clings to Marvin's leg and peeks around, eyes luminous with a child's absolute confidence that men in suits are sometimes just bored grown-ups. "We're neighbors," Agnes says, and the word is a scalpel. She has seen better versions of everything, better neighbors, better men, better causes. She has made a career of steering films and reputations. She does not smile much at strangers. But she looks at Jack differently than she looks at Marvin, less like a possibly useful thing and more like something uncomplicated in a life that tastes of calculus and contracts. Nathan's proposition is clinical, offered across a marble table with an efficiency that would make most men bristle. There is an admission. The trust will authorize funding for Jack's necessary treatment only if the child's primary guardian can be presented as part of a stable family unit recognized by the Whites. The legal team has phrased it as a sound fiduciary safeguard, no misuse of funds, no public scandal, but the implication hangs in the air. They will approve a guardian who is married into the family. "Marvin," Nathan says, as if he is choosing a word like one chooses a tool. "You care for that boy. We can make sure he gets the care he needs, but the board must see a relationship that ties him into our stewardship. Marriages mean legal recognition, estate continuity. It is stricter than philanthropy. There are clauses. There is a list of conditions. There is an offer of temporary residence at a wing of the family estate where Jack could attend a private clinic sessions. There is a strange sort of kindness with teeth. Marvin listens like a man at a trench. The room smells faintly of citrus and old money. He thinks of pediatricians who have been kind and of nights when the small chest beside him has been shallow and the ambulance has been too far. He thinks of the times he woke up in colder barracks and tightened his grip on whatever promise lingered. He thinks of the way Jack says, "Daddy," a sound that rewires the world. His lawyer, Samir, later sets the legal realities on the table with the bluntness of someone who has seen the same hunger dressed in better suits. If they control the trust, they control who can access the specialized care, Samir says, tapping a paragraph. Without that funding, the state would have to step in, or you sink into debt and they place the child where they think it's sustainable. The white legal team can, if they want to, argue their way to appointing a conservator. It's not common, but in a high-profile case it happens. "But I'm his father," Marvin says. The word father slides into the air and sounds too small for what it contains. "You care for him. The law looks for legally enforceable guardianship," Samir replies. "A marriage could provide a simple path, recognition by the trust, and a public anchor. Or you can fight with paperwork for years and pray the child doesn't need the treatment while you're waiting." Marvin thinks of Jack's laugh, of scraped knees and the nights he practices read aloud, of school forms signed with his own shaky letters. He thinks of the dog tag under the pillow. The decision is not a moral calculus, it's a survival plan written in ink and necessity. Agnes's attorney, Mrs. Halverson, lays out the terms with the cool voice of someone who prefers outcomes to emotions. The contract will be a marriage in appearance and in law for a set period. Public duties, mutual residence in name, joint signatory status for the specific trust disbursements that concern Jack. It will stipulate that Marvin will have temporary legal guardianship rights recognized by the White Board for the limited purpose of medical decisions and financial stewardship related to Jack's care. The clause is explicit. If Marvin and Agnes separate before a specified date, a mediated review will take place. The agreement is designed to look like a bridge to stability, not a permanent alteration to the White family line. Marvin reads the line about temporary legal guardianship twice and feels the syllables in his mouth like something foreign. There is a signature line and a notary block. Across the room, Jack is tracing the wood grain of a coffee table and humming a song he learned on TV. "Why me?" Marvin asks, voice a small, honest thing. Nathan doesn't look surprised. "Because you are the one the child trusts. Because you are present in a way we cannot manufacture. Because you are not a threat to our succession. On the contrary, you keep our problems small." Agnes watches him as if trying to decide whether he will be a useful instrument or a mistake. There is a tiny hardness in the set of her mouth that softens when she sees Jack's small face. It is almost invisible. For the first time in a long time, Marvin sees the vulnerability of someone practiced at dominance. He says yes before he can argue the moral architecture, before he can imagine what it will mean to let his life be rearranged by a family that counts its kindnesses in legal pads. He signs because the pen in his hand is a lever, and because Jack's small chest needs the trust more than Marvin needs the illusion of autonomy. He signs because he is a man who remembers promises to those in his charge. The wedding is small and functional, no vows that will be read for cameras. Just 2 signatures, a photographer, and a discreet entry in a registry that will be more useful to a board than to any fairy tale. Agnes steps close, and for a moment their shoulders brush, an accidental contact that leaves Marvin alert with a strange, sudden warmth. Jack hangs back, clutching his dog tag, looking like a prince out of place. When they leave the White Mansion that afternoon, the headlines whispering along the city feed do what headlines do. They rearrange people's curiosity. Heiress marries neighbor in private ceremony, reads a brief line on a news site. The comment section does everything to human dignity and then some. But inside, Marvin feels the solidity of having purchased a certain kind of time. If this story, one man giving everything for a child, has grabbed you, like the video now. It helps us tell more stories that start in sacrifice and turn into something dangerous and true. Home is a different kind of stage now. Agnes has a schedule that includes red carpets, production meetings, and dinners in rooms with waiters who know her name. She returns home to the apartment with Marvin and Jack, and the small incongruence of a woman in couture among mismatched cutlery. At first, she treats the marriage like a transaction. Meals are polite, conversation is economical. She keeps her distance, like someone who believes intimacy is a liability. Marvin's intimacy is less declarative. It's burritos at midnight because Jack likes the way the cheese droops. It's holding a feverish child's head against his chest while the TV plays cartoons like a soft anesthesia. He wipes cereal from Jack's chin and irons a shirt for Agnes for a corporate meeting because she forgot it in a rush. He makes lists like a man who tries to control the small things that threaten to seep into chaos. There is a scene, a tiny perfect beat that tells more about them than any grand speech. Marvin is in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, hands floury from a sandwich he is making for Jack's lunch. Agnes walks in, shell-shocked from a late production argument, mascara a faint roadmap of fatigue. Marvin doesn't stare. He slides the plate toward her and nods. She takes it because the movement is small and practical, and because under the silk there is a person who understands how to be sustained by small kindness. "You didn't have to," she says, voice softer than her public face. "I have to," he replies. "He calls me Daddy, Agnes. He needs someone to answer." She looks at Jack, sleeping in the other room, a boy already awake in dreams, and something in her shifts. Maybe it's because there is a sound of people who will break for the child, or because she remembers being the child of decisions she didn't make. For a moment, she lets the armor drop and answers with a quiet "thank you" that tastes of something like recognition. That recognition complicates everything. They begin to live in the same orbit, but on different planes. Agnes goes to shoots. Marvin takes Jack to the clinic. She argues with producers. He argues with caseworkers. The Whites host a board meeting in which murmurs flutter like birds. Edward White, Nathan's younger son, moves through the house with a predator's ease. He smiles at Marvin in a way that feels like a measuring stick. Kevin, Agnes's ex, appears sometimes like bad weather, too charming by ordinance, too close to slights, a man who can misplace empathy in a poker game. A small fracture starts at the edges and grows, a faint, unexplained fainting. Agnes misses a call on set, staggers briefly backstage, the kind of stumble that in any other life would be called a Tuesday. She brushes it off in interviews. On a morning when rain washes the city clean, she finds herself in a hospital corridor and an MRI machine that hums like an indifferent god. The doctors are careful and not unkind. They say things that are both technical and poetic in the way that people who hold bad news are when they want to cushion impact. Her neurologist, the kind of woman whose steady voice could soothe a room of entire panic, says words that cut into tissue like a scalpel. There are lesions in the areas that handle recent memories. The pattern suggests a progressive impairment to her ability to form new memories. The term they use is blunt and clinical, and Marvin hears it as if through water. Retrograde could be wrong, anterograde amnesia, progressive memory loss, a degenerative process that steals hours and names. They present options. They present a surgery, experimental, with risk. Without intervention, the doctor says, we can expect increasing gaps. With intervention, we may be able to arrest progression, possibly improve formation of new memories. I will be honest, the surgery is risky,
There are no guarantees. There are trade-offs. Recovery will be unpredictable. Marvin listens to the options the way a soldier listens to a plan before a mission. He catalogs risk. He sees a probability map. He calculates what he will do if the cost is his own sleep, his own heart. Agnes sits with a hand over her mouth, looking very small. For the first time, the White family sees the fragility they've been shielding under production schedules and philanthropy pages. Boardroom whispers sharpen into knives. Edward sees an opportunity where others see tragedy. He argues that with Agnes's mental state in question, the board needs a stewardship vote. If the family can't be confident in her capacity to guide the company, then a fiduciary mechanism must engage. He frames it as prudence. He dresses the plot in the cloth of responsibility. Kevin leans close and feeds his opinions into the air like fanning a flame. The board meetings become a terrain where morality is translated into votes and legalese. Edward's motives are visible, the ambition that smells like oil. He wants the throne with a gentler throne-sitter at his side. Marvin feels them like a swarm. He thinks of Jack's small hands and the dog tag. He feels the contract's legal framework tightening like a corset. He sits in a small hospital chair night after night, holding Agnes's hand through tests, holding Jack's head as he sleeps on a recliner. He studies the doctor's charts until the letters blur and becomes a translator for a life that must be simplified to survive.
At one legal meeting, Agnes's corporate attorney presents an addendum that matters more than any production schedule. The company's succession clause allows for a temporary conservatorship when a sudden incapacity is medically declared. Should that happen, the board could appoint a steward. Marvin knows the sentence in his bones. If the board chooses a steward who is not him, someone like Edward, the way to jackknife the family's influence into something different will be swift. The marriage contract had been a shield, but shields rust if not guarded. "Your best course," Samir tells Marvin in a low voice after a particularly overheated boardroom debate, "is to make your guardianship undeniable, not just legally, but practically. Build credibility. Show them you're the anchor. The board can't ignore what the press ignores when the proof is obvious." Marvin starts to carry proof like a second skin. He files documents, shows up consistently, documents consultations, keeps receipts. He photographs Jack's medication schedule. He keeps a log of days and nights when Agnes is not herself. He learns to be a man who loves via lists and appointments. It is unromantic and necessary. And then there are the fences. On a Sunday afternoon, after a cloud-heavy week of whispers, Marvin drives out to the White hunting preserve because Agnes had asked him to check on something. Her wedding ring, lost somewhere amid the birch and underbrush, and gives him a task that feels domestic enough to be a solve. The preserve is a man-made wilderness of paths and wooden cabins, with hunting stands and a history of stag nights and closed-door votes. It used to be a background for men in tweed. Now it starts to taste like menace. Marvin notices the fence first, a break in the barrier that should have kept animals in trouble out. A post it split, wire twisted like a cruel joke. There are paw prints nearby, too long for a deer, too something else to be accidental. He notices the way a tree has been scraped, the bark torn as if by a heavy animal. It's the kind of detail he notices by training, a suspicion the size of a bite. Night in the military teaches you that things that look like accidents are often not. He reports the broken fence into the house log. A landscaper says it could be a bear, sometimes they stray. Edward's expression when Marvin mentions the broken wire is an unreadable mask. Kevin shrugs as if to say, "Nature happens." But Marvin doesn't swallow it. There is something in the pattern. Prior to a meeting, a small fright. A small fracture in security that could be leveraged into sympathy toward a caretaker who is dangerously close to being declared unfit. One evening, a truck backfires on the road and excites a chain of events. Jack, stirring from a nightmare, calls out for Marvin and is consoled. Marvin soothes him and checks the door locks. On his way back, he finds a smear of disturbed earth by the kitchen window, a sign that someone tried to force entry and failed. He calls Dana, who comes like a knight in sensible shoes, and together they find an empty bottle with a label of an obscure pesticide, something used to mask scent on hunting gear, the kind of equipment you use when you're staging an animal incident. Edward practices the face of an innocent man with a talent. He shows up at the house to ensure their safety and offers to fund repairs. He brings an aura of benevolence, and under that, the smell of someone who has borrowed people's trust and repurposed it. Marvin accepts the repairs because he has to accept that the hand given in the house of power comes with price tags that no one can ignore. By then, Agnes's scans have filled 2 more folders. The neurologist speaks of a surgery that could, in theory, halt the progression, an operation involving a conservative resection and targeted therapy to reduce the acute lesions. "We have a small chance at arresting what is occurring," she says. "We can slow the march, we can try to preserve what is present, but there are real risks. The surgery sits at the edge of what we can safely remove without producing a different deficit. We must be honest. She may lose the memories formed in the recent past even if we succeed. We may stop the disease from worsening, or we may accelerate certain deficits." Agnes listens to the words like a woman cataloging items before a fire. She asks about recovery time, about her ability to return to work. Marvin watches her count the ways she will measure herself in cameras and audience metrics. He knows what matters most. He thinks of the day he signed the contract and how small the signature seemed compared to the years it would anchor. "I will sign the consent," says Marvin to the doctor. "If you need someone in the room, I will be there." The board demands proof of their stewardship. Edward circles like a hawk and suggests second opinions and extended deliberations, subtle delays that could turn an urgent window into a bureaucratic stalemate. Kevin leaks a rumor to a tabloid about marital stress and unusual arrangements. The story runs, and the board's patience frays into a public relations calculation. Nathan counts votes in a way that looks like arithmetic, but has the moral mess of a ledger. Marvin is exhausted, but there is a clarity in exhaustion. He has done worse in worse places. He can move a barricade with his hands and look danger in the face without flinching. For all the wealth and the ways it dresses itself in velvet, his muscle memory serves a purpose. He is a protector. He can read a quiet that smells wrong. At night, he pins photographs to his phone. A frame of Jack laughing in Sunday sunlight, a clip of Agnes at a rap party when she had laughed genuine laughter, a screenshot of a call log showing a suspicious number that had called the preserve's maintenance that morning. Marvin squeezes the dog tag in his pocket, a rhythm to remind him of what matters. He prays in a language that has words for action rather than miracles. He did what he had to do. He married his neighbor by contract to keep his child safe. Now the rest is a thin and delicate waiting until the outcome of a surgery neither bought nor guaranteed, and the slow, slippery work of proving that love, even when it begins as a legal transaction, is sometimes the only truth left standing in a house built on inheritance and ambition. The surgeon did not speak like a man offering comfort. He spoke like someone who had seen enough of the human mind to know where mercy runs out. "She made it through," he said. "We stabilized the lesions we could access. There was bleeding in a delicate area. We controlled it. The operation met its goals. But I have to be blunt. She has deficits in forming new memories. Recent events, years, maybe months, could be hazy or gone. We did not cure the underlying condition. We bought time, and with it comes uncertainty." Marvin's hands had stopped moving. The dog tag sat warm and heavy in his palm. He let the weight of it pull him down into something like steadiness. He had signed the papers, argued with trustees, and slept in chairs until his back ached. He had married a neighbor to keep one small life steady. Now the work began to prove the marriage had a heart behind it. Agnes opened her eyes as if surfacing from deep water. For a beat, she watched the ceiling, disoriented, and then the room tilted into shapes. A nurse said her name like a careful promise. Marvin stepped forward and, without thinking, reached for her hand. She stared at him, then at the dog tag in his fist, then at Jack's small reflection in the corner, already curled asleep against a faded blanket. "Do I know you?" she asked, quietly, as if asking the name of a song she couldn't place. The room folded. Marvin felt the ground go thin. He had imagined 1,000 cruelties. He had not imagined this particular vocabulary of loss. He dropped to a chair and memorized her face, as if committing it to a ledger. The small, slivered scar at the corner of her lip, the way her eyelashes cast tiny shadows. He remembered the first time they had met at a fundraiser. He remembered signing the contract. He remembered, as clearly as a map, nights of burritos and midnight cartoons. "Agnes," he said, "I'm Marvin. I'm your husband." The word tasted strange on his tongue, an honorifics he had never expected to carry. Agnes blinked, brows knitting in a way that suggested she was trying to assemble the puzzle of a life. "Husband," she repeated, testing the syllables. The sound had no weight for her. It was a label in a book she was still learning to read. They tried to be kind. The White family moved through the hospital with a choreography learned over years. Sit, watch, measure reactions, call consultants. Nathan paced the corridor in a way that looks like prayer for someone who placed his faith in calculations. Edward arrived with an expression composed to code concern that doubled as calculation. Kevin slipped through with small talk that smelled to Marvin like a trail meant to distract. Dana stood at the periphery with a face like a shield. The legal front opened like a second theater. Edward, with the board's counsel, whispered prudence and the need for stewardship in terms that sounded like love for the company. He suggested assembling a conservatorship committee until Agnes's capacity could be evaluated over months. The suggestion arrived in form as if it were common sense, as if the alternative was childlike whim. Marvin had Samir file an emergency motion that same afternoon, an injunction asserting Marvin's temporary guardianship rights under the terms of the contract and seeking a temporary restraining order to prevent any unilateral appointment of a conservator while the trust's obligations were being clarified. Samir's words on paper were blunt. The Whites had written themselves power, and they had used that power as leverage to extract compliance. The motion leaned on the trust's charter, the marriage contract, and the documented medical need for immediate decisions about Agnes's care. That paper did not end the conversation. It forced it into a room lit with lawyers and cameras and angry whispers, but it did not stop Edward from arranging a closed session of the board and whispering stories to those who measured value by shares and reputations. "We must protect the company," he said publicly. He said it again, softer, in the hallways where votes are made. Marvin, meanwhile, kept doing the work that could not be legislated. He stayed. He logged every consultation, every phone call, every item of evidence he could find that suggested the incidents at the preserve were engineered. Dana supplied him with a lot more than supplies and quiet sympathy. She handed him call logs and made copies of maintenance invoices, and at 3 in the morning she found a worker willing to say what he had seen. The worker's hands shook as he told Marvin that a white pickup had idled near the broken fence the week before, and that someone had delivered a coil of wire and a canister with a smell like solvent. The man's voice broke when he said he had been paid in cash. "Who arranged the job?" asked Marvin. He repeated a name, a contractor who had worked for the Whites before, a man who collected checks and passed on orders. The paper trail led not directly to Edward, but it led to a middleman who had done favors for Edward's circle. Marvin pinned the pieces together with the patience of a man building a case. He pinned the photo of the split post to the file next to a voicemail timestamp and a text exchange where the contractor had promised, "We'll make it look like animals." The board meeting, where Edward moved to appoint a steward, did not feel like a battle. It felt like an inquest into trust. Nathan sat like a judge. Outside, a line of reporters waited, pens poised. Marvin stood up when his turn came and spoke with a voice that had the single focus of a man who had learned to put his life where his words were. "I married Agnes because Jack needed a path to care," he said. "I asked for time. You have already given terms. The trust funds exist for children like Jack. The trust's charter requires guardianship recognition, and that is what's at issue. But we are talking about a woman who just came out of brain surgery. This should not be a moment for opportunism." Edward smiled in a way that was meant to disarm. "And yet you arrived here with a marriage that many view as convenient," he said. "Conveniencies do not always indicate the best guardian. We must be careful about perception." Marvin had anticipated the smell of that knife, the accusation that he had bought his way into influence. It was a familiar accusation, one men like him had heard in other rooms where power was doled out. He did not try to talk Edward into liking him. He produced evidence. He had a video clip on his phone, security footage taken by a worker on the preserve who had installed a new camera on the gazebo. The file showed a white pickup making an odd stop near the fence, a man unloading a coil of wire. The timestamp coincided with other logs Dana had dug out, call records from the contractor's phone to a number that traced to a burner that by process of paper trails and bank records had been paid by a shell account linked in turn to one of Edward's vendors. He had photos of the pesticide bottle found outside Marvin's kitchen, the label still clinging to the plastic. He had testimony from the landscaper who had noticed that the strands were cut in a way that suggested human intervention, not animal. He had a call log showing that a number used by an assistant in Edward's office had called the preserve's maintenance the night before the fence was found broken. The pattern was mounting. "That's hearsay," Edward snapped. "You can assemble coincidences and string them like beads without a direct link." Samir interrupted with the dry violence of an expert. "We have chain of custody for physical evidence, witness statements, text messages, bank transfers. We're presenting the board with a forensic timeline. If you will justify a conservatorship based on a risk that was manufactured by the very people pushing for stewardship, then you are not protecting the company, you are empowering a coup." The board sat with mouths shut. Nathan's face folded into something like a ledger closing. He knew numbers. He did not like being surprised by personal betrayal. But law moves like a heavy road, slow and indented with precedent. The board put a hold on taking immediate action. They voted to convene an external independent review and a forensics team. It was not a full victory. It was time. Time was what Marvin had purchased months ago with his signature and with nights of vigilance. Edward did not sit back. He did what men like him do when a plan unravels. He pivoted to a smear. He arranged leaks to spin the narrative that Marvin had manipulated the marriage for personal gain, that his presence in the house was disruptive to Agnes's treatment. He floated the idea that Marvin might be seeking to leverage the trust for criminal advantage. The whisper campaign had an effect. A gossip piece with the right questions at the right time could make a board think twice. It could make donors nervous. Marvin countered, not with counter-whispers, but with facts and a witness who wanted to avoid his conscience for too long. The groundskeeper, an old man named Luis, who had been paid under the table to close his eyes, showed up with calloused hands and a hat that had known the sun too long. He had been afraid. He had also been listening when Edward or someone like him had made a joke about making a scare they can't ignore. "I kept quiet because I needed the work," Luis said, voice thin as wire. "But I could not sit and watch a boy, no boy, lose a home. I didn't know it was a plan at first. They said secure the fence, make it look like the hunt. But they gave me money, cash only, and a number to call to confirm." His testimony did something the videos could not. It put a human mouth on the pattern. It made tawdry things look like intent. People who had been complacent noticed how quickly practical cruelty could become policy. As the forensic report came in, it brought more than muddy footprints. It found residue on the post that matched the solvent used to disguise human touch at the preserve. It found fibers that matched a blanket from a vehicle linked to a vendor that frequently did jobs for Edward. Transaction records showed payments that went to the contractor's shell company precisely on the dates in question. A security camera at the service entrance caught two men in hoodies who entered with a box and left with more noise than sense. When the footage was enhanced, a hand raised a sleeve and a ring flashed, a peculiar signet that, with a search of corporate photographers' archives, belonged to a watch Edward had gifted publicly the previous season. Confrontation became inevitable. Edward asked for a private meeting. Marvin accepted. They stood in a room of glass and sunlight, as if the house wanted its own moral arbiter to look on. Edward's voice was low, his eyes measured. "You overplayed your hand. You made public accusations. You brought the press. You risked the company's stability." "I brought evidence," Marvin replied. "You tried to manufacture a problem to benefit from its solution. That is not stewardship. That's theft by leverage." Edward smiled, the kind of smile that thinks itself a scalpel. "And what would you have us do? Ignore a medical reality?" "Then investigate before you award the agency," Marvin said. "Don't use incapacity as a ladder." They clashed with words that threatened to burn the backdrop of the family. Edward's anger slipped into menace. "People will believe the man who looks the part," he said. "You and your boy." "He's my son," Marvin said. The words were a simple fact that tasted like steel. Edward's lip curled. "We'll see whether the courts agree," he said. "We have influence." He did not get to decide alone. Nathan, who had watched with a face like a map trying to fold itself into the right place, finally spoke into the room with a voice that had the surprising texture of regret. "We do not get to decide a woman's life because someone smells opportunity," he said. "We are a family that built a company on stories. We must be able to tell them the truth." The board's independent counsel recommended a pause and then a careful vote. The conservatorship motion was tabled. It was not a victory like a shout. It was a victory like a cough that meant life continued. Behind the legal drama, the private drama unfolded in small, intimate ways. Agnes's days were a series of blank pages she could not read. Some mornings she would remember a film crew's face and a script she had once written. Other times she would not know where she had placed a glass. She often could not remember signing the contract that made Marvin her husband. There were good days. She would remember laughing at a joke Marvin had told, and bad days. She would think she had been interrupted mid-call to someone who didn't exist. At first, the gaps became a place for manipulators to plant seeds. Edward suggested certain helpers who would look after her finances, little hands that pressed for signatures and for medical proxies. He framed it as care. He used other people's worry like scaffolding. He attempted to pull the company's direction toward his tastes. He leaned on allies. Marvin's resistance came less from strategic bravado and more from the quiet accumulation of proof and presence. He tacked images of Jack's school forms to the refrigerator. He brought Agnes a plate at 2 in the morning, the same movement that had once earned a soft thank you. He built a home of repetition and reliability because recent memory can be rebuilt not only by brain cells but by habit. He also gathered proof beyond the preserve, emails, drafts, and a ledger someone had tried to scrub. Samir subpoenaed voicemail records, bank statements, and a set of internal messages that showed Edward's office had requested certain arrangements at the preserve the week the fence was broken. It was the kind of thing that reads like conspiracy until it reads like planning. The tipping point came in a boardroom that the city would later watch in highlights.
Edward tried to call witnesses who would talk about convenience and questionable motives.
He called a PR spin, assembled sympathetic pieces, and made a speech about stability. Nathan listened, stone-faced. Marvin presented the forensics report, Lewis's testimony, video footage, and a chain of custody that left little room for slippage. He handed the board a packet with time-stamped evidence, all the things conspirators hope will remain separate and private. "Mr. White," Marvin said, quietly, as he slid the final file across the table and met his face. "You know who your sister is in a way the rest of the world does not. You also know she isn't well. But if you seek to use her illness as an opportunity, then you have moved from stewardship to sabotage." Edward's face flushed. He tried to turn the meeting into moral equivalence, but he was outmaneuvered by details that move with the inexorable weight of truth. The board voted against the conservatorship. They recommended an external oversight team, but ruled that control would remain with the existing legal arrangement while investigations proceeded. Edward's plan to seize the company had been slowed, not entirely crushed, but slowed was enough. The legal system is not a blade, but a plow. It turns and grinds and makes a field, but nothing changes in a day. Charges were investigated. Edward found the board cooling on his ambitions. The press began to ask harder questions. Certain vendors who had facilitated payments found audits at their doors. Kevin's name surfaced in emails. He tried to claim plausible deniability and fell apart in the face of subpoenaed bank records. In private, there were other confrontations. Kevin found Marvin alone in the parking garage and approached with a posture like a man who needed to be taken in hand. He wanted to start a fight. Marvin's hands were steady, the calm of a man used to controlling chaos. "You stay away from Jack," Kevin said, trying to sound like a threat. "You worry about your own choices," Marvin answered, small and lethal. "Stay away." Kevin left with the kind of anger that sounded like a promise. A week later, he was in the news for a different reason, an incriminating bank transfer, a recorded phone call that placed him on the contractor's line the night the fence was compromised. Once you have the papers and the people, the little lies begin to crumble. Through all of this, Jack slept in their apartment and played with blocks and called Marvin Daddy with an ease that made both men and the world around them soften. He had no sense of the legal chessboard. To him, life was peanut butter sandwiches and superhero cartoons. Marvin held that small, unchanged truth like armor. Agnes, in the weeks after surgery, often looked at him with asking eyes. Some mornings she would reach for the movie script she'd once been proud of and find it as foreign as a photograph. Other mornings she would remember an insignificant kindness and let her face uncrumple in a way that made Marvin feel like the world had been loaned back briefly. There was a scene that would later be replayed as evidence, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Agnes was in the kitchen one fogged morning, coffee steaming in her hands. She frowned as though trying to read a book in a language she'd once known. Marvin came in with a burrito, the simple assembly he had once prepared at midnight. He placed it on the counter without ceremony. "I made two," he said. "One for Jack, one for you if you want it." She looked at the burrito, then at him, and then burst into laughter. Not the big public laugh she had once offered, but something private. "You make burritos like my mother used to," she said, and the two words were a rumor of memory. "Your mother had better spices," Marvin said, grinning. It was not a revelation, it was a crack in the plaster. Small things like warmth, smell, and routine are the scaffolding with which people reconstruct meaning. Agnes began to anchor in those scaffolds. She did not remember signing the contract, but she did begin, slowly, to recognize the way Marvin's hands moved with a boy's scraped knee, the way he read the same book in the same voice until Jack's eyes drooped. She began to accept him not as a figure in a legal paragraph, but as a presence who offered safety in repeated gestures. The final unmasking of the conspirators came not in the courtroom but in the valley between press and private, when a lone security camera at the preserve, one no one had thought to check at first, had captured a man wearing a jacket with a distinctive patch, a supplier's logo that Edward's office had used. The footage caught a second man with a vehicle registered to a shell company. When footage was enhanced and timelines matched, a pattern of phone calls and bank transfers appeared, like footprints in wet cement. Edward tried to deflect and to flail. He arranged a press release that attempted to cast Marvin as an opportunist. It read like a kind of desperate flourish. Marvin's response was not to shout, but to hand over direct evidence to a DA investigator who had been looking at the case the way a surgeon looks for an aneurysm, with methodical suspense. The DA's office moved faster than gossip. They recommended indictments on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud against the trust and for arranging a scheme to manipulate the guardianship process. The city buzzed. Headlines that had once whispered of an heiress marrying a neighbor now described a plot that smelled of greed and manipulation. Publicly, Agnes watched the spectacle with a confusion that varied in intensity. Sometimes the camera would catch her in a corridor, eyes far away. Other times she would sit through a deposition, steady and listening, offering testimony that came less from memory than from the scaffolding of repeated fact. She testified that she had agreed to the marriage in part to secure Jack's care, and that she had never expected to be used as a pawn. Her voice in court had a thinness, but also a sharpness. She had once known how to shape stories, and even when memory betrayed her, she could identify fact from falsity. Edward's fall was not sudden. Men who have held power long do not lose it in an afternoon. But power is a fragile thing when others have documented your missteps. Shareholders who cared about reputation and future deals began to look for steadiness. Nathan, whose old hands had folded many a decision into ledger form, stepped in to shield the company from scandal. He offered to restructure certain board oversight and to bring in independent management consultants. He froze certain transfers. That still did not erase what had been done, but it threaded safety back into a house that had been shaking. The criminal case moved slowly. Indictments were announced like distant thunder. Edward's press team tried to paint it as a witch hunt. The court did not accept that story. Evidence is a thing that will not, in the end, be spun into rich fabric when its threads are cut. Through it all, Marvin found himself in places he had never expected. Testifying in a hearing, giving depositions, sitting through days of interviews. He was tired in a way that demanded more than sleep. But his work was not about vindication, it was about Jack. Every form filled, every timestamp printed, every call recorded was about keeping the child's life intact. When the DA's office formally suggested charging certain vendors and a set of individuals implicated in the scheme, the world took note. Edward's legal maneuverings became a long, expensive affair. The board's reshuffling left him isolated in the house where he had once thought his ascension inevitable. People who once kissed his ring now crossed the room with faces cooled by distance. It would have been a lie to say that all scars healed. Agnes continued to have days of drift when the world felt scraped of name and purpose. Sometimes she would ask where she had left a script and then discover it in a stack of notes Marvin had kept. Sometimes she would look at Jack and try to place him in a life that felt like a photograph with the corners cut away. The scene that finally delivered the emotional arc they all needed was not a courtroom nor a boardroom, but a Saturday afternoon in their small apartment. Jack had a loose tooth that day. He was nervous about it and had arranged a ceremony where he would let it fall into a vintage cup and make a wish. Marvin sat at the kitchen table making a burrito with a habit born of necessity. Agnes sat across, folding the edge of a napkin with concentration. "Are you going to keep the tooth?" she asked, voice steady for a moment. Jack nodded. He had a seriousness about certain rituals that made Marvin smile.
Agnes reached across the table and, before she thought about it, brushed a crumb off Marvin's hand, the smallest of touches. The gesture landed like a pebble that rippled outward.
"You always do that," she said, wonder in her eyes. "You always make sure he has a taste of normal. It's not a grand thing, it's everything." Marvin felt something warm and dangerous lift in him. He had married a woman for a contract to save a child. He had hoped the contract would remain a pragmatic act. He had not expected the way care can become a bond that has no clause. "I do," he said, "because it's his world." "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly, and her eyes were direct as sunlight. He thought of nights in barracks, nights in courtrooms, nights in hospital chairs, and how all of them had led him back to a small boy's pillow and a dog tag hidden beneath it. "I regret the cost," he said, honest. "I regret the nights that broke us, but I don't regret keeping him." Agnes let the words sit between them. She reached for Jack's tooth, balancing it on her finger like a small planet. She looked at Marvin not as an instrument, but as a person whose choices had created a safety that had nothing to do with corporate maps. "I don't remember the contract the way it was. I don't remember signing paper. I remember a man who fed my son when I was too tired to notice him. That matters." It was a kind of choosing that cannot be coerced. It was not the fruition of a sudden awakening, but the result of accumulated acts that had weight. Agnes chose to identify the man who had stood in the margins and to allow room for a new narrative. She did not, in that moment, remember the precise moments of their past, but she could see his actions. Actions are a language the brain sometimes trusts when memory does not. The case against Edward and the others continued to move through legal channels. There would be financial penalties and criminal indictments and, in time, trials. White Pictures Board underwent a reshaping. Nathan began to speak more gently in public about the price of legacy. The trust's charter was re-examined to include clearer safeguards against manipulation, an irony that did not escape the press. Life for Marvin slid back into a rhythm neither wholly new nor wholly old. He continued to make lists and keep records. He continued to bring burritos and to sit through board meetings when necessary. But there were also mornings when he took Jack to the park and let the boy run, and did not measure every step as though it could be litigated. There were nights when Agnes would drift into the room, look at Jack asleep, and remember the smallest things. How his cheek fit into the crook of her arm, how the smell of his hair reminded her of something warm. One evening, months after the surgery, Nathan called Marvin and asked him to meet in the study at the mansion. Marvin, who had been through rooms with harsher air, went anyway. Nathan was older now, in a way that suggested a map had been folded again. He poured them both tea. "You did what was right for the boy," Nathan said, not looking at the tea. "You kept your word." Marvin bristled at praise. He preferred to think of himself as a man who had done only what any decent person would. But he had also been hardened by experience. He said simply, "I did what I had to." Nathan looked at him for a long moment, then pulled a thin envelope from a drawer. "The trust will be audited and some protections added," he said. "That will help. There's also the matter of your advocacy in front of the board. It mattered." Marvin took the envelope and opened it to find a brief letter, an offer of continued support for Jack's care under terms that did not require Marvin to be in a servile position. It was a formalization of what had been bought by his signature and earned by his presence. It was an acknowledgement of the debt the family had to itself. "You deserve to be with him without all the rumor," Nathan added, "and Agnes—" He paused, then cleared his throat. "Agnes deserves a chance to make decisions on her own terms. We'll help structure that." Marvin nodded, a man folding private gratitude into the evening. Agnes, in time, rebuilt her life not as a return to some prior version, but as a new thing. She was cautious in interviews, honest about her amnesia when public questions were tender. She accepted therapy and the slow work of forming new memories. She also began to make choices that belonged to her, new projects she could manage within limits, philanthropic initiatives shaped by the truth she had lived. She did not, as the doctors had warned, recover all that had been erased, but she created a life in which new memories were possible, and she consciously built them with people who had stood for her when she was most vulnerable. The transformation between Marvin and Agnes from contractual allies to chosen family did not occur in a single cinematic scene. It happened in the mundane. A hand placed on a fevered brow, a burrito in a wrapper at midnight, a signature in a courtroom, a shared grief at a funeral. The legal bond, initially signed with expediency, bloomed over time and trial into something that tasted like affection. The final scene that sealed the arc, in a way both small and decisive, was not a public announcement, but a private settling. On a rainy afternoon, they gathered in the apartment for dinner. Jack had insisted on spaghetti with extra sauce as a test of appetite. Agnes laughed at a story Marvin told about a misfired cue on a set. The laugh was full. It was not a full retrieval of a lifetime, but it was true. After the dishes were cleared, Agnes stood and reached for Marvin's hand. She had no grand speech to make. She had no memory that would be presented as a trophy. She simply said, "I don't remember everything. I remember enough to want this, with you, with Jack." Marvin felt the thing inside him, something that had been sealed and weathered, opened with a softness so precise it made him dizzy.
He thought of the dog tag, of the contract, of every night in hospital chairs and every insignificant kindness that had added up to truth. "Then let's keep making it," he said. "We'll keep making it together." Jack, from the hallway, called out in the voice of certainty that children have toward the world, "Daddy, you have the extra meatballs!" Agnes smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and the word "daddy" landed in the room like a bell. She repeated it, softly, tasting it, shaping it around meaning. It did not erase what had been lost. It was instead an acceptance of what had been given, a family made not by ease, but by choice. Later, when the camera crews had left and the trust had been reorganized and the indictments were processed, Marvin sat at the kitchen table and smoothed a photograph he had taken months earlier. Jack laughing on a sunlit bench, Agnes a half step behind them, hands full of takeout. He placed the dog tag beside the photo and let the small metals and paper sit together like proof. He had married his neighbor by contract to protect a child. The legal documents had been the first act. The second, much harder act had been to keep showing up when the world attempted to weaponize memory and family, and to prove that the fidelity of an ordinary man can outlast carefully constructed schemes. In the end, it was not law alone that kept them, though law had mattered. It was the accumulation of small human things: burritos, phone calls, evidence, nights in chairs, a groundskeeper with a guilty heart, and a pile of plain, stubborn care. If this story stayed with you, if the idea of someone risking reputation and comfort for a child touched you, subscribe for more stories that turn quiet sacrifice into stubborn love. Share this with someone who believes protection sometimes looks like ordinary devotion. They did not get a fairy tale. Agnes's memories remained patchwork. There were days she could not name a film she had once made. There were nights she woke unsure of where she belonged. But the child she had touched when she saw Jack for the first time, the boy who called Marvin Daddy, remained. The marriage contract that had been a legal move became a life they chose to live into. They rebuilt not a past, but a future. And in the small domestic light of their apartment, with a dog tag warm under a pillow and a plate of cold burrito on the counter, they kept making it.